The 17th century is my favourite century, as we said. The old standard view was that there was a scientific revolution in the 17th century where modern science was born. For the last few decades, the young revisionists have gotten in there and argued that there wasn't a scientific revolution. So what went on there? Lots of things went on there. I can tap it on here, can't I? The rebels argue that science was continuous before, during and after, but I'm saying that there were at least three revolutions concurrently there. There was the scientific revolution, there was the metaphysical or philosophical revolution, there was a theological revolution, as you'll see, as well as all sorts of political and social revolutions going on around the place. Against the idea that there was no scientific revolution, Basil Willey, the 1930s Cambridge poet, produced an interesting book on the 17th century where he showed that the concept of explanation changed across the century. The concept of what was accepted as an explanation in 1700 was vastly different from 1600, so something changed noticeably across there. There was a revolution in science because what was added was the belief in laws of nature and the actual practical mathematisation of nature. The change in explanation is part of the change in the philosophical revolution that went on there, but there was a change in the concept of God. And as Alistair MacIntyre said 30 or 40 years ago, the God in whom the 19th and early 20th centuries came to disbelieve had been invented only in the 17th century. And that's part of what we'll see tonight. And the people who invented this new God labelled themselves Christians. This change was brought about by the virtuosi. Now, why are they called virtuosi? Because that's what Robert Boyle labelled them all. The word scientist wasn't invented until about the middle 19th century. So for these people who are doing all these marvellous new investigations and things, we call them virtuosi after Robert Boyle's usually appropriate description. If you're interested, Alistair MacIntyre, when he wrote that, was an atheist Marxist philosopher. He later became an Augustinian Roman Catholic, and he's been on the editorial board of the Christian Philosophers Association. And his wife, Linda Summer-Joy, wrote the major textbook on the central figure of this century, a fellow named Gassendi. And you all say, who? Background changes. The important connection with the classical world is 1417, when Poggio Bracciolini rediscovered Lucretius's Epicurean materialist anti-religion poem De Rerum Natura in southern Germany. This was where Democritus and Epicurus had invented a physics of the world that there are only atoms and a vacuum. Everything is made out of atoms moving around in the vacuum, and there is nothing else, was the claim. 1455 or thereabouts, the printing press was invented, and by 1500 there were 4 editions of this Latin poem rolling off the printing presses. So from before and all through the Reformation, this Latin Epicurean atheist poem was spreading right through Europe because Latin was the language of education. And that point's important because all the historians of the 17th century and science and everything else have missed how widespread this poem was in its influence on everybody there. They keep saying, oh, the atheists and the rest of them we haven't got any names for them. Well, there were tens of thousands of them who'd read this poem. The 16th century, there was the so-called Reformation, where they all squabbled and nobody ever asked, what do we have in common? And nobody ever asked, how should a Christian treat those with whom he disagrees? They only emphasised differences, condemned to the devil anyone who differed and disagreed, even condemning them to flames in this world and the next. There were all these wars of religion, but a lot of them were largely founding wars of the modern nation state. They just all get labelled as, but I won't go into the politics of that, they get labelled as religious wars. The 17th century was chaos on steroids. One of the profound effects on it all was that there was a global mini ice age. And there has been a maxi book produced recently by an English historian who is multilingual, and this is his study of the effects of that global ice age right around the globe. Amongst his many languages are Chinese and Japanese, and the effects were terrible everywhere. Crops were reduced, there were famines, deaths, wars, revolutions, plagues. 75,000 people died in London in 1 year. We worry about 5 MERS in Korea. A great fire of London burnt down over 60 church buildings apart from everything else. They had such interesting activities as chopping off the head of the Archbishop of Canterbury, chopping off the King's head, setting up a Puritan republic, smashing all but one of the pipe organs in England, smashing stained glass windows, altar rail statues, banning Christmas, forcing businesses to be open on Christmas Day, banning Easter, and generally behaving like the atheists when they took control of the French Revolution and like ISIS is doing in Syria. The Protestants split all over the place over anything, everything and nothing, as usual. And this is a list of the English dissenting groups which blew up between 1600 and 1660. The last of the Muggletonians only died about 5 years ago. And there are the Baptists, and they proved that they were proper Protestants by promptly splitting over a theological point into Calvinists and Arminians. All of these groups were known for their enthusiasm, which is a bit like all the charismatic enthusiasm that goes on now. And the English humour, the English gentleman and middle class couldn't cope with all of this enthusiasm. And there's a marvellous gravestone over one Anglican priest which lists his name and his birth, and it says, "And he preached all his life without enthusiasm." But across the 17th century, at the beginning of the 17th century, Aristotelianism, Platonism, Stoicism, Epicureanism were still considered as serious possible schools of philosophy for the way of life and living and everything else. Part of what we'll track is how the first 3 were knocked out, leaving only the last one, which only left Christianity and Epicureanism for control of science by the end of the century. We'll start with Galileo, who found Epicurus's atoms concept useful in science, and he started using it in the late 16th century. And a couple of priests got upset and reported him to the Inquisition because, in usual doctrinal manner, they worried that this scientific concept would disturb the doctrine of transubstantiation. The Inquisition looked at their complaint and dismissed it without ever bothering to call Galileo. His astronomy, seeing movement and change in the heavens, was destructive of Aristotle's system, and his trial, as I've covered before, was actually over the authority to interpret the Bible given the best science of the day. Francis Bacon, 1605. I've said the 17th century was chaos on steroids. It's my favourite century, and I'll put this up here because this is all the people of note in the 16th century, largely in England, and all the groups and arguments and everything that went on there. It is so much it just doesn't fit on one sheet of paper. And in 1605, the Gunpowder Plot, where Guy Fawkes tried to blow up the whole Houses of Parliament. As somebody once said, the only man who ever entered Parliament with honest intentions. Christmas trees are first mentioned. Shakespeare produced King Lear and Macbeth, and Francis Bacon wrote The Advancement of Learning, which is a fairly quiet year for the 17th century. In The Advancement of Learning, Bacon was setting up the idea of modern science with inductive inference. And he was a Democritian, which is significant in all of this. Democritus was really the founder of materialism. He and Leucippus invented the ideas of atoms, materialism, determinism, evolution, anti-design arguments, overlapping with Socrates, that far back. And that's what's written into Lucretius's Epicurean poem. Francis Bacon was an obsessive Democritian, so much so that everything that he took from Epicurus and Lucretius he attributes back to Democritus. And he was the person who decided that science's job was to exploit nature. He even said to his servant, "The world was made for man, not man for the world." And about a month ago I found an interesting article, and I can't find it since, and I didn't finish reading it, which started decoding some of his late works, which seems as though he's labelled as a Christian, but he was moving to the point where it looks as though he was beginning to set up for a war between science and Christianity. When I find that reference, I'll let you know. Next person of note, Marin Mersenne, a Roman Catholic priest in France who did some wonderful work on the maths of music and really calculated our modern tuning system for music, our mean tone temperament. He was involved, tremendously well connected. He was using any advance in science to back up his Roman Catholic beliefs and to batter everyone else, beliefs in transubstantiation and everything else. He was about the first person to realise this wasn't getting him anywhere. So he stood back a bit and said, actually, why don't we just focus on what we do agree with in science across everything? And from his monastery cell, he became the equivalent of the Royal Society before it was formed. He coordinated all the work of the philosophers, scientists, proto-scientists and everybody else across all of Europe and England. And he did an amazing job in that. Descartes wrote to Mersenne and said, "I'm producing this wonderful new system. Can you get these half dozen people please to write a critique on it for me?" And Mersenne, with his reputation, had no problem getting all of that. One of the most notables was Gassendi, whom you're going to hear about, and Gassendi shredded Descartes' philosophy. But the arrangement was all the critics had to be printed in the one volume by Mersenne. Once that was done, Descartes took control back. Instead of answering Gassendi, he stripped it out and republished it himself without the critique. No. (1624), notable year. Lord Edward Herbert of Cherbury published De Veritate, which became the founding document of Deism. Gassendi published his first frontal attack on Aristotelianism, and these three met in Paris as a result of an after effect of the sinning of Dort, an interesting event, which produced the blackest tulip ever to come out of Holland. By their fruits ye shall know them. We'll get to these people a bit more. Thomas Hobbes, a frightened little man, said so himself. He was born, he said, at the sound of the cannon for the Spanish Armada, and spent all his life being frightened by wars and everything else. He became a materialist, and he became the model straw man of atheism. Hobbesism became a code word for atheists across the 17th century. Look at that, he lived to 91. He declared that the state of nature is war, life is nasty, brutish and short, and he did most of the work in knocking Stoicism out as a way of philosophy, which is interesting because it's the Stoics who'd attacked atheism back 55 BC with Lucretius's poem and led a huge attack on atheism. And whenever Christianity has descended to being just an ethical system, it's always been Stoic. Descartes, I partly mentioned, he produced a mechanical philosophy. Everything is mechanical. He had a plenum. Everything was full. There was no vacuum. There's no occult forces to pull anywhere. Everything has to move, which provided a lot of fun for having an arrow flying through the air because he had to have the molecules rushing around from the front of the arrow around the back to keep pushing it. But his no occult forces became powerful across Europe, which provided problems for the acceptance of Newton's science, because Newton suddenly invented this force of gravity which could reach out across the vacuum of space and pull things in. And they said, we're getting rid of all this occult stuff with our new science, and you're bringing occult forces back in. So it took quite a while for Newton to be accepted after that. Descartes also decided that the human body could be studied as pure mechanism, but he realised we don't hold mechanical things ethically responsible, so he invented his idea of dualism to get around this. And not many of the others through the rest of the century took enough notice of what was needed here. The Cambridge Neoplatonists, led by Henry Moore, were the last hurrah for Platonism, and it died with them. But they were largely Neoplatonists, theologians and such like, which is interesting because Neoplatonism is paganism. But in the middle of some of their very clever work, and they were quite bright scholars there, they invented, one of them invented the word self-consciousness. And you think, oh, what did they do without that word? So when Platonism collapsed, what had Christianity taken from Platonism that disturbed it? Well, they'd taken Plato as a great support for the concept of the immortality of the soul, ignoring the fact that Plato's concept of the soul was vastly different. They'd taken ideas of the ideal world, not matter or body, and this affects some of the later scholars and theologians who forget about the resurrection of the body. And they took ideas of God's perfections, and I think a lot of the arguments for the perfections of God are actually arguments for Platonic perfection, not a Christian concept of perfection. But out of this group came one, on the periphery, one very interesting woman, Anne Conway. I'd like to hold a few flags for her, but the biggest flag I want to fly for her tonight is that in critiquing her contemporary Spinoza's philosophy, she picked up the flaw in all philosophical systems. And she pointed out that Spinoza had given his single substance, God or nature, all and only the characteristics that he needed to get the conclusions that he wanted. And this is the problem with all philosophical systems and all ideas of following the argument wherever it leads. It's going to lead is determined by the presuppositions with which you start. And she was the first person to nail this. Lucy Hutchinson is interesting. She provided the first translation of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. She and her husband were staunch Baptists. She was a bit slow in getting to the printers, though. It was only published in 1997. For interesting reasons. She and her husband were involved in the big civil war, and her husband was one of those who signed the death warrant of the king. At the Restoration in 1660, those who weren't dead had mostly fled to America and had streets in Boston named after them. Mr. Hutchinson stayed and was arrested. All the family property was stripped off and he was thrown into jail. But they didn't have much occupational health and safety stuff in those days, and he somehow or other just happened to die in jail. It happened quite often in those days for difficult people. And Lucy Hutchinson disappears from the record. We have no idea when or where she died or anything, in spite of her having been quite a notable literary lady. So, as I say, her work was published in 1997, finally. The first translation into English of this materialist poem. Then comes the centrepiece of the 17th century changes, Pierre Gassendi, who was an amazingly Renaissance sort of fellow. His work in all sorts of fields and what he did, he called himself an historian of science, but he was just amazing. And he was the fellow who, when his frontal attack on Aristotelianism failed, then adapted Epicurean atomism and physics to Christianity to oppose Aristotelianism. And he realised that there was a problem with this because Epicurean physics and Epicurean metaphysics and Epicurean morality all came as one attractive package in Lucretius's poem. And this provided a lot of headaches for people hereafter. So as Aristotle was destroyed, what had Christianity taken from Aristotle that they lost? Their logic, their rhetoric, their science, their astronomy, and a lot of the metaphysics. Scholasticism was based on Aristotle. The next important fellow is Walter Charlton, who was also a well-travelled, well-connected. He met Gassendi in Paris, took his work and translated it, this adaptation of Epicureanism into Christianity. Walter Charlton was for a while president of the Royal College of Physicians, amongst other interests that he had. But he realised also you had to separate the fragments of it. Epicurean physics, yes, atoms in a void did look useful for science, but you had to be careful about the Epicurean metaphysics, which is all materialist, all the groundwork for the atheists. And the Epicurean morality was hedonism. This is an interesting bit of problems because Epicurus himself had a very quietist morality. He set up a quiet, caring community which included women, slaves, anybody in Athens there. But with this idea that there is no God, no nothing else, it always, very often descended into hedonism, wild, lascivious parties, to put it mildly. And that was one of the groups in Paris that Gassendi was associated with, but didn't get involved with that side of their lifestyle. They were a literary group, and he used all their literary influence, and there is no evidence in his writings or in anybody in that libertine group that he got involved in any of their orgies or carry on at all. He stayed as a good Roman Catholic priest out of that side of things. This translation by Charlton of Gassendi's work had an enormous impact. It influenced Boyle, Newton, Huygens, Leeuwenhoek, and everybody who was anybody in the Royal Society. They were all influenced by this Charlton Gassendi Epicurus poem. And when I said this to one of my philosophers, she said, "Oh, you're going to have to do a whole thesis to prove that." And I said, no, I've been trawling the bowels of the vast myth for 15 years now. And the effect of this poem on each of the people in the Royal Society has been documented. Nobody has put it all together. So it really only takes one paragraph with a mass of footnotes. They all changed their philosophies out of it.
So are you going to write that?
No, not my interest there. But there was a problem in the terminology, as I said last time. That atoms was the word invented by Democritus, the founder of this whole process, and this was a philosophical label, atheist label, because atoms meant uncuttable. And this was meant to mean they are indestructible, which means that they are eternal, which means they were never created by any god. Boyle and Newton realised the concept of atoms was useful, so they changed the name to corpuscles and corpuscularianism. But we've dropped that. So they were accepting the physics, but rejecting the metaphysics. Walter Charlton did lots of interesting writing. And the centrepiece for the talk tonight is Robert Boyle, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society and really founded modern research chemistry. He realised how useful the atomic theory was in chemistry, changed the name to corpuscles, but at the same time he realised that the people who were involved with all of this, reading this Epicurean poem, were using the word nature in an interesting way. And what he nailed was that they were using the word nature as a substitute God. Nature does this, nature does that, nature plans this and all the rest of it. So he put up an interesting book where he argued that there is no such thing as nature. It is just what goes on. Sounds wonderful until you see what he did himself. He was arguing against nature with a capital N. People think that Boyle was a wonderful Christian scientist, and he was saying that creation was a wonderful thing, a wonderful, huge event there. He was also saying that creation itself is a marvellous, great clockwork machine. And he was saying God is a wonderful creative genius. That's actually not what Boyle was saying. From Cicero, who led the attacks on Epicurus way back 55 BC, Boyle developed his concepts of a wonderful mechanical contrivance using the model of the cathedral at Strasbourg. Hello, Kevin. Where I haven't got to picking on him yet. And he used as his model the complex clock on Strasbourg Cathedral, where each component is an unconscious tiny component part which knows nothing, is aware of nothing, but the whole, it contributes to the whole, which is a beautiful piece of machinery, which is way beyond the product of chance. All the parts are controlled by invisible mechanical forces and all are the result of intelligence. Out of a few very few laws of nature, Boyle had invented the same mechanical machine of the universe as Democritus, Epicurus and Lucretius. But he attributed it all to beginning to God, arguing that such a wondrous contrivance could not have come about by chance. Since creation, nature simply runs its blind mechanical course, much the same as mechanical determinism of the materialist atheist. So when you look at what he was saying, first of all, he said, creation is a marvellous completed event. There's no concept of God's continuing interest in creation, his sustenance and involvement with it. That was wiped out altogether. It's a completed event back there. And what's more, God couldn't interfere because of the laws of nature. He also was saying creation is nothing but a marvellous, huge clockwork machine. No spirits, no spiritual anything. It is just a clockwork machine. Wonderful, huge. And then, having invented this idea of a gigantic, nothing but clockwork machine, he then imposed this idea on God. And he then said that God is nothing but a wonderful clockwork machine maker. He has no other interest in humanity or anything else. This is not Christianity. This is the invention of a new religion, Deism, invented by Robert Boyle. That's the staggering thing that I realised recently. He never asked why, he only ever asked how. There's a bit of a contradiction in his system because he thinks God has wonderful power to set up and run this machine, but the laws of nature exclude God from doing anything in his creation. No providence, no miracles. They're impossible because of science. And he at this stage was still saying, yes, but there were miracles back there at the founding of the Christian church. It took the next generation to say, well, if there's no miracles now and you've ruled them out, then there were none anywhere there either. All set up by Boyle. He said, God is all-powerful and has ends way beyond human comprehension, which was an escape clause for pretending that he was covering everything. He saw the goodness and power of God only in the order and harmony of nature. He defined providence as the maintenance of the universal and benevolent order. Boyle rejected Epicurean atheist materialism, and he thought he was defending Christianity. But in repeatedly adapting bits of Christianity to his new view of science, he'd not so much rejected Christianity as he had created a new religion. Deism is a halfway house between Christianity, Christian theism, and the Epicurean atheism. The only difference is he's got a God who made it all at the beginning. How did he get away with proposing that everything is pure mechanism and nothing more? Well, the interesting thing is that Calvinism, that heresy, was the dominant theology of England of the time, and Calvinist double predestination, Epicurean materialism and Deism are all the same in their end result. They all say that your life is fixed from before you are conceived. So it was no big philosophical shift to move between these three views. Is the material realm an autonomous order? Boyle said, well, no, because the autonomous blind matter can't by itself obey natural laws. So he then set about separating Epicurus' physics and metaphysics. Epicurus had proposed infinite eternal atoms of various sorts, infinite space and time, and chance given this creates all. Boyle pointed out accurately that Epicurus had assumed what he had to prove. And so Boyle, in opposition, asserted, first of all, that God made the atoms space and time, secondly, that God put the atoms into motion, and thirdly, that God formed the atoms into the structures and creatures of the nature. And he talked about the chance of letters in a printing workshop falling onto the right place to make a poem. It's just not possible. And he also asserted that mind is more than brain, so it needs God to put it all together into this form.
Both of those seem to be good points.
Argument from design. On that natural religion, Deism in effect, from nature he argued that God exists. Repeatedly, he sort of acknowledged God the Redeemer, but he worshipped only God the Creator and Governor of the universe. He looked on the Bible less as a record of God's dispensation to man than as a further and higher revelation of his omnipotence. Boyle centred his religion on awestruck and even fearful worship of the Creator's power. He almost never mentioned Jesus Christ, he always discussed the Creator. Redemption had no part in his thoughts. And the marvellous book, historian's book on the theology of all of these people, was written by an American who comments that Boyle talked about sin like an American discussing cricket. He'd heard about it, but he'd never seen it close at hand. So this ran over into his morality, which is not a path to spiritual growth, it was a rule governing action. He thought that religious practice was like a commercial transaction. Eternal bliss can be purchased by reasonable monthly instalments of holy living. And Christ's death had established a contractual situation of which man can take advantage through obedience. A man is a fool to let such an opportunity pass, which is very much like Pascal's wager of earlier in the century. On reason and faith, reason has never been defined, but when you look at it carefully, he's saying reason is limited. Reason means what? It was never defined in the Enlightenment. They used reason as a weapon and a banner, but never defined it. Half of modern dictionaries of philosophy have no entry for reason. Half of those that do see reasoning, and those that try to explain reason muddle up talking about reasoning. And what most people seem to mean when they talk about reason is reasoning within a naturalistic metaphysics. Only biblical revelation is above reason. Salvation is comprehensible when revealed, but he wiped them off in other writings. And he said that the proper function is, I cannot allow that the intellect of man is the genuine standard or truth, so that whatever surpasses his comprehension must not be admitted to be. But he'd actually removed everything that he didn't comprehend. Things that were above reason, he decided were, well, he left the category empty. What drove him to all of this? When he was 20, Boyle came back from his tour of Europe, straight into the huge cauldron of the English Civil War. And as a 20-year-old, he was shocked by the violence, verbal, physical, murderous of the whole event. And he wrote a couple of interesting letters to two friends. One where he said, if you look at it all closely, you'd give up religion. It's all fighting over trifles, he said to somebody else. And they don't look at anything of the fundamental truths on which they agree. So he was never involved in any sectarian disputes, and he always professed the broadest tolerance. The Bible was supposed to be the unifying factor of the Reformation. It became the battleground of the Reformation. And out of this, Boyle decided that the only thing we can agree on is the other writings of God, which is the book of nature, so that's all I'm going to deal with. And the virtuosi from here on gradually displaced the Bible from their work, from their writings and their thoughts.
Sorry, what is virtuosi?
Oh, that was the name I introduced at the beginning, which is the word scientist hadn't been invented. And Boyle used this word virtuosi to describe all the people who are involved in all of this, creating the Royal Society, New Thoughts and everything else. So we're using that term to sort out between natural philosophers, scientists and all the rest of it when they didn't have all the terminology. Put them under virtuosi and you can include anybody who said anything in that century.
And what was the book of nature?
The book of nature is the creation. We've got two books God's given us. One is the book of the Bible and the other one is the book of nature, and they both say the same things. But we fight over the book, the Bible, so we'll only work on the other book that he's given us, the creation itself.
Mm.
Isaac Newton came out in 1687 with his Principia. He had a mechanical, mathematical universe. Gravity, the force of gravity equals G m1 m2 over d squared. And when his followers got rather enthusiastic, he quietened them down a little by saying, look, all this does is describe what goes on under the influence of whatever gravity is. It does not tell you what gravity is or how it works. It's merely descriptive. And the laws of nature, I would say, are nothing more than a mental abstraction from observed regularities, which get mathematised. What is gravity? Well, it's an occult force. Energy? We still don't know. Time, space, goodness knows. All of his arguments in reason and faith are all head stuff. And when you look at his life, I even start to wonder if he was, amongst some of these others, on the autistic Asperger's end of the spectrum. Relationships totally dysfunctional. His moral code was nothing to do with love, it was just the things that you said thou shalt not about. God the Father, absolute power was what he thought was wonderful, but God can't upset his own laws of nature. And we get rid of the mysteries in religion, but we'll accept all the mysteries in science. We have no idea what gravity, energy or anything else is, but we'll keep on going because that's what makes it work. So they were very selective about which mysteries they rejected. Locke, in 1690, produced an essay concerning human understanding, which builds into philosophy Epicurean epistemology. The mind is born blank, and the only information we have is what comes through our five senses, so he cut out all religious information, all religious experience or knowledge. And as Leibniz looked at this system and commented, yes, he's explained everything except the mind itself. Salvation was by moral activity. You add up the pleasures and pains like a counting clerk. And John Locke gave advice to some friends on how to bring up their children, and it was nothing better than Newton could have written.
What was that, sorry? What did you say?
Locke wrote some advice for friends on how to bring up children,
Okay.
and it was from somebody who had never married, never had any close relationships, no children, no nothing. And it's just a whole rigid system, like James Mill brought up John Stuart Mill. Gone and forgotten are the notions of redemption, regeneration and spiritual growth. Cool calculation displaces religious fervour as the mainspring of moral activity. And ultimate salvation became a matter of carefully adding pleasures and pains to balance the books in the black. It was religion made reasonable to the counting clerk. In 1695, he produced his Reasonableness of Christianity, and he called himself a Christian and he was defending Christianity. But what he had actually done in there was to prune Christianity of everything that didn't fit his definition of reasonable. And what was left was Deism. And interestingly, in that same year, 1695, Toland, who labelled himself a Deist, produced one of the Bibles of the Deist debate, which I'll deal with next time, Christianity Not Mysterious. The only difference between these two is that Toland called himself a Christian and Locke called him, Toland called himself a Deist, and Locke went on calling himself a Christian. 1792, Kant produced religion within the bounds of mere reason, which is the same sort of thing. Nicolaus Walterstorff, one of the founders of the Christian Philosophers Association, produced a book, Reason Within the Bounds of Religion, which is well worth a read if you want to get hold of that. Locke admitted in theory that religion might accept doctrines above reason, but he didn't leave any significant beliefs to fill that category. He interpreted Christianity in such a manner that it eliminated everything above common sense in the guise of removing absurdities and superstitions. He gave two reasons for his work. One was to settle all these religious disputes, and second, to refute the Deist claim that Christianity contains doctrines beyond comprehension, mysteries. And yet, that's what he presented. His own life was impeccable, worthy of the best tradition, but his writings about it are dry, intellectual concepts. On Reason and Faith, he came to say that human understanding can know everything that is worth knowing because it has been given by God. He couldn't have God putting any limitations on it, or he made the reason the arbiter even of those doctrines that he said were above reason. He treated faith as being quite inferior to knowledge and didn't give it much role. And he also said that God's acts conform to the pattern of mechanical nature. Pure deism. No sort of Christian philosopher. He is followed by William Petty, who started using reason, as he called it, as a tool of criticism of the Bible and of the Christianity. Everything must be plainly understood, no mysteries. And from this point on, natural religion ceased to support Christianity and began to replace it. This is the end point of my discussion of the 17th century, when Samuel Clarke and Anthony Collins had this debate over can matter think.
Okay.
Samuel Clarke was a protege of Isaac Newton, and like Isaac Newton, he was an Arian. He didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. If you want an interesting comparison, Princess Queen Caroline put him up for Archbishop of Canterbury. And the comment was, "Yes, ma'am, he is the most intelligent man in all England. He is the most virtuous man in all England. He is the most wonderful man in all England. He has but one deficit. He is not a Christian." And you compare this 300 years later with the episode in Yes, Prime Minister, where they're choosing a new bishop. And the Prime Minister's wife points out to him that some of these people on the list don't believe in God. And he says the next day in his office, "Oh, what's this theology stuff? What are they doing there? What goes on? Some of these people for bishops don't even believe in God." And his lovely senior public servant says, "Theology, Prime Minister, is a means of keeping atheists within the church." Can matter think? And I put that as the end point because in this debate, Anthony Collins, who called himself a deist, invented the concept of emergent properties. It wasn't given that name until John Stuart Mill invented the name for emergent properties in the 19th century. But the whole concept is laid out there in Anthony Collins, who from work with his mentor, John Locke, he had decided that quantitative change or changes in position and organisation of matter can produce qualitative changes. And the best way to understand this sort of argument is to say that you put a carrot seed in the ground, and this carrot, by quantitative changes and selection of dirt, will make a carrot, which is a huge qualitative change. So Collins has made another step from there and said, by similar process, matter can think. So once you've got matter being able to think, you've got then the replacement of the Epicurean materialist framework from Galileo and Francis Bacon as a complete system of matter can think and have intelligence now. So that's why I take that as the end point of this whole debate. And in his second to last letter, Samuel Clarke accused Anthony Collins of being a materialist, atheist, determinist. And Anthony Collins knew his ecclesiastics and his theology, and he said, and his reply was, yes, well, when I look at this Calvinist double predestination stuff, it doesn't look any different. And in his corner for the next letter, final letter, Samuel Clarke knew he couldn't answer it with the way things were then. He throws dust everywhere for about 30 pages and shuts the debate down and walks away. Were there any opponents of this change? Very few. The theologians were in a complete shambles because with the Puritan takeover, they pushed out all of the Anglicans who wouldn't change over. Then in the Restoration, they pushed out all the Puritans who wouldn't change over, and then you get another episode in 1714 so all the principled, able people in theology and ecclesiastics were in a shambles and had left. And there's almost nobody who was dealing with anything. These are the only names I can find of anyone who did any reasonable analysis from a theological perspective of what was going on in science and what the philosophy of the scientists was. And the best of the lot was the Puritan Richard Baxter, who was largely self-educated. He produced 2 quietly reasoned, careful articles, and he picked the core of it. He said, since they study nothing but matter and motion thoroughly, they reduced everything to those principles. He picked the nub of the problem. So Christians lost their influence effect across the 17th century. Why? Well, firstly because they'd incorporated bits of Platonism, Aristotelian and Stoicism, and as these were knocked out, Christianity was diminished. It's lost its intellectual clout and ability to sort itself out. There was no Christian philosophy around, no Christian philosophers to deal with the situation. And in 1691, when Boyle died, he set up in his will the Boyle Lectures. He recognised that Epicureanism was widespread and Deism was rising, but he'd invented Deism, and the Boyle Lectures were for natural theology to argue against Epicureans, Deists and various other nasty people. And the rather abrasive, brilliant young fellow, Richard Bentley, was given the job of giving the first Boyle Lectures in 1692. And he wrote to Isaac Newton for advice, and it's in that correspondence from Isaac Newton that you find out how much of a deist Isaac Newton was. The Christians argued with each other. They only agreed on the basics of science and all the rest of it. And this opened the way for the Epicurean materialists and the Deists at the end of the century to say, well, that's the only thing you can agree on because that's all there is. All the other stuff you fight and argue and kill about is all your religious imagination. Laid themselves open for this charge. So in summary, the metaphysics of science had changed from a vaguely Christianised Aristotelianism at the beginning of the century to a vaguely Christianised Epicureanism at the end of the century, which was actually Deism. Epicurean materialism continues as the metaphysics within which the modern world sees science, so much so that if you attack the naturalistic framework, as some of the Christian philosophers do, this is taken as an attack on science. They just can't consider science out of any other framework. A coda. What I've said is that the whole concept of explanation changed across the 17th century from essences and substances and everything else to mechanical, scientific, reductionist explanations at the end. That's the world in which I was brought up in the 50s, the medical school in the 60s, and when I started out in medicine. Why did this happen, doctor? Well, you give the scientific explanation and that was it. By the end of my career, the world had changed. The 60s New Age explosion and all the rest of it. When somebody said, "Why did this happen, Doctor?" I'd have to carefully find out what they meant by an explanation. Karma, crystals, amazing sorts of things. Very rare would anyone take the scientific explanation as being it. Some people would incorporate it as part of their explanation, and other patients would just dismiss it, not even listen to it. And that is bad enough that even the scientists have noticed. And there's an interesting book published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, 1997, The Flight from Science and Reason. And it's interesting to see what gets scientists knickers in a knot about all the attacks on science ever since then. So the addendum to the coda, my next talk in about 6 weeks' time is on Deism, which will have two elements to it. Part of it you'll see going back to this, where it comes from the scientific world, but part of it, as you listen to it, you'll hear critical liberal theology. And if Kevin's interested next year, I'd like to do a couple of talks. One on how Deism, which was thought to be wiped out in England, went into Germany and became the philosophical basis of liberal theology, which is not a heresy, it's a different religion. And then another talk later on how once Deism broke the nexus, the tie between Christian theism and theology, then from there on you get all the rampant ideas about God and everything else that goes on since 1800.
Well, I've heard that Kevin wants to really move into Leonard, so we'll give other people a bit of a chance first. If you've got any questions before Leonard gets ripped to pieces.
Kevin's too tired for such things. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I'm very grateful. You've obviously spent a long time reading about this stuff, and I'm very grateful that you have shared what you have. My obvious question is kind of very much an open-ended one, and that is, well, okay, so, well then, how do we actually resolve all that? Because, it's...
What you're saying, what should our response be?
Yeah, what then should we do?
Yeah. So what?
Francis Schaeffer read that book.
How then should we live? Well, my next talk is on the Deist debate that exploded with all of this. And what I'm saying, what I had previously thought was that it came out of all the science. What I now realise is that they simply took off the covers that these scientists and philosophers had kept on calling themselves Christians. That Deist debate is regarded as having been snuffed out in England, but the next part of my studies is to track how that went into Germany in the 18th century and became the philosophical basis of critical liberal theology, then how that came back to the West, because it broke the nexus, the tie between Western theology and the Christian God of theism. And that's why you get all these academic ideas on God and religion and everything else that go through what are still labelled Christian institutions, when in fact that critical liberal theology is Deism. It's a foreign religion. It's not even a heresy of Christianity, it's a different religion. So I'm puzzled as to how they got into the Christian theological colleges. So that's the bits for next year. How it went into Germany and became the basis of critical liberal theology, and then what it did when it came back into the rest of the Western Church with all the shambles that has occurred. And so that's why the Western mainline denominations are now sideline denominations.
I think there's probably more than one factor going on there.
Yeah, but the academic strand of it has been Deist.
Could you just give us a very brief comparison of the differences between theism and Deism?
Well, that's what Boyle was doing there in saying that it's all made by God. That's the only real difference from the Epicurean atheists. He made it all and that it all run on its own. So And this is what Lord Edward Herbert of Cherbury did in 1624 when he laid the philosophical basis for it. Therefore, there is no revelation, no scriptures, no incarnation, no miracles, no resurrection. That's Deism. The laws of nature are it, they control everything.
We don't need a God who is watching or interested in what's happening.
Not at all.
We don't need a God who's powerful and knowledgeable.
No, he just made it all and is all hands on.
But I would have thought that, I mean, that as a theological idea is kind of surpassed now anyway. Like it's like that's 1800s or something. And as a starting point, I mean, that is for me that is a starting point. You know, you look around and you go, well, the first piece of evidence for God is the book of nature, is creation.
I think modern atheists who are prepared to let Christians be Christians, theists be theists, as long as they keep quiet about what they believe, do so on the basis that it's okay if they want to have a God that set everything up, as long as we then leave everything else as it is. It's basically allowing us to be deists if we really want to. Have been the limiters to what they'll allow for us, so that we can have a God who is not involved.
That's an open question. Bart Ehrman, would he consider himself a deist?
He would be pretty darn close to it.
He defines himself as a gnostic.
Yeah.
So he doesn't know whether to believe in God or not, but he's pretty close to atheist.
Who's this?
Bart Ehrman?
Oh, right.
Never heard of him.
He's a New Testament scholar. But like the easiest way to define Deism is it's atheism for people who can't have the guts to be atheists. So they act like it's atheism. They work on a mechanistic framework where functionally it's atheist. They just kind of put some.
Can't quite believe in atheism.
Yeah, they just.
Well, you know, that might be reasonable for some people.
Yeah, I mean, effectively what they do is they act like atheists, they walk and talk like atheists, they just kind of put some gaudy sprinkles on the top. That's effectively what happened, and you see that in the framework that we heard tonight. So you have a mechanistic universe that works irrespective of a God maintaining, that's the idea of sustenance, maintaining of it. There's no maintenance, there's no necessary maintenance. All that happens is you start the clock and then it goes. So it's not that hard to go from that point to an atheistic framework.
The difference shows up with
a question relating to that. Like, what is actually the Christian view on that? Like, some people, Christians, would say that God is present and sustaining to every atom, molecule, all the time, so it's constantly involved, rather than constructing some laws and letting it run. So is that really the official Christian view?
Categorically, I'd argue. Like from a Christian point of view, that from a biblical perspective, you have the ongoing sustenance and the ongoing creation, and that's repeated in all kinds of ways. Most fun one, and I recognise my bias with this, is Chesterton. So Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy. No, not my son. No, the guy that I named my son after. Chesterton. Now I'm getting confused. Chesterton talks about the process of repeating an action as being a God-like thing. That God continually makes sunrises and makes every daisy alike and those kind of things. Repeats actions because of his eternal appetite of infancy, his constant sense of energy and vitality that allows him to do that. So whereas with Deism, it's the thing of he's really powerful, he gets it going and then leaves it. Christianity has maintained a sense of God continually maintaining these things and continually creating another page and that kind of stuff. I'm sorry.
The difference shows up with somebody like Bishop John Shelby Spong, who is a radical liberal, wipes out everything, except we're all equal because we're all in the image of God. And you think to yourself, well, hang on, what is it to be in the image of Spong's deistic God? It means that I would impregnate a woman and walk away and have nothing more to do with the pregnancy, the birth, the child, the upbringing, education, or anything. That is Spong's God. That's the deist God. Walks away and leaves it completely. And out of that, how do you get any sense of equality or worth?
I'm not sure that you've actually answered Perry's original question, which is, so what?
You weren't supposed to notice that.
But yeah,
I thought his answer was coming along next time.
yeah, that's what
And next year, and next year. Yes.
I can probably give you two, like as a guess. One is that one of his central arguments is that the scientific approach that people like Boyle articulate as part of the Royal Society is based on philosophical underpinnings, primarily around Epicureanism, when the other three kind of fell down. There's almost a Bradbury-esque kind of feel to it, you know, like Stephen Bradbury, the Australian ice skater, who when the other three fell down, he ran through. Well, it's kind of like Stoicism, Aristotelianism, and Platonism. They all fell down, and the one kind of skating across the line was Epicureanism. So I think that's a really valuable point for two reasons practically. The first is that often when we get into discussions with people who are kind of from this atheistic scientific perspective, they continually present their arguments as being just a factual thing with no philosophical underpinnings. They're just the facts, they're just the science. And what you're trying to show here is that everything is driven by a particular philosophical system, and in this case, it's Epicureanism. So just kind of calling that bluff is quite a useful tool as a first point. And then the kind of deeper one under that is that if there's a group of people who have philosophical underpinnings that they don't even realise that they have, then if you understand those philosophical underpinnings, you can actually combat, and particularly if those philosophical underpinnings have been already combated by somebody else, particularly Stoics and Platonists and stuff like that, if we can find those arguments, then we can kind of sneak in, and it's kind of like, you know, a hole in the wall. They didn't even realise that they had this wall, so we can kind of come sneaking around and say, by the way, you realise that you're basing that on this, this and this. Well, that's been disproven philosophically by this, this and this. So bang, bang, bang.
The best source of information on that is the early church fathers.
Yeah.
Because Cicero led a Stoic attack. He knew Lucretius in Rome. He liked him as a person, but just hated his atheist philosophy as a Stoic. Stoics were sort of pantheists. So he started a huge campaign in which all the other schools of thought joined in against the atheists. Because remember, it was Plato who said society can't trust atheists. It wasn't a religious nutter. And on the end of that war, the early church joined in, and they did what you're saying. They picked all of these arguments and collated them all. So it's all actually back there in the early church fathers, dealing with this whole question. And a lot of those early church fathers are brilliant. Some of them are also rants, but some of them in there have some magnificent stuff to say about all of this same argument, because they were dealing with it.
You're more or less saying that, you know, you're saying we can have a go at the Epicureanism, but you're more or less saying that we've inherited Epicureanism within our church.
The early church dealt with it in a big way, because it was a big live argument.
I have a problem with the way we choose our clergy. The traditional churches have put them through certain institutions and got them to get certain degrees, and when they have those qualifications, they're welcomed with open arms into positions of power in the churches, and they shouldn't be. And you go to some of these people and say, do you believe in the judgment? Do you believe there is a real hell? Do you believe there is going to be a choice? And they say, no, 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 and they come out non-Christian in every question you ask them. Why are they holding a position of professional responsibility in a Christian church when they're not Christians?
That's what happened in the 18th century in Germany.
Well, there's always arguments about who's a Christian, because very often some people mean my take on this set of important doctrines, that's Christian. I mean,
But I'm talking about some people who 99% of us would say are not Christian, and yet we're putting them as ministers in churches.
My
I've been in
question is,
church
why do
where
they
the
want
minister gave a big sermon,
I'm not sure why they would want
and
to
it
do
was Epicurean philosophy. He was saying that evolution is true, billions of years are true.
Well, hang on, let's hold it there. How many Christians in the room are open-minded to that thought? You know?
I'm not making that
Yeah.
point on which we pivot everything. But
Things like believing in the resurrection.
Oh, yeah.
This guy,
I'll go with that.
this guy asked a question in a sermon: what message are we taking to our world in the 21st century? What is Christianity going to offer in the 21st century? We can't say there are miracles. We can't say Jesus actually was raised from the dead. We don't know. We can't say there's life after death. We can't say there's a judgment. We can't say there's a hell. We can't say all these other things. What is it we are going to say? And he tried to come up with something that he felt was meaningful. And no one in the whole church dared to raise a voice against him and said, why are you talking to us like that? We've got answers to all those questions, and none of them you accept. Why are you here talking to us?
On another topic, I like Isaac Newton.
That's one.
And you accused him of being
An Arian and a Deist.
well, I admit he was an Arian, and I can quite believe that he had Asperger's. But he wrote more on the Bible than he did on science. And also, he believed in a God who intervened. When you hear the story of Laplace...
No, he didn't.
Well, I'd love to hear this.
All right. When you had the story of Laplace talking to Napoleon, and Napoleon asked the question, and what part does God play in this? And he replied, I have no need of that hypothesis. The topic at hand was explaining the stability or instability of the orbits of the planets around the Sun. And because Isaac Newton had worked out that the orbits of the planets around the Sun ought to be unstable. And so what he suggested was that occasionally God kind of poked in and pushed the planets into place and stabilised it. And whereas Laplace actually came up with the theory, what he thought was a theory that could explain that the orbits of the planets were stable. And so that's what the topic of the question was. Where does God fit into this? And Laplace said, I have no need of that hypothesis. But it ended up that they were both wrong. Because Isaac Newton was right, the orbits of the planets are unstable, but God was not poking in and stabilised it. Whereas Laplace thought that had a theory that the orbits of the planets were stable, but he was wrong. But the point of the matter is that Newton actually believed that God intervened.
Only in the mechanics of the universe. Because he needed this because of his gravitational thing. And you get this contradiction in Hawking's book, The Short History of Time, where at one stage he says, well, Newton should have seen that with gravity going forever it would pull everything in and collapse it, and he was too dumb to see it. And then about 20 pages later he says, well, Newton saw all of this, and he had to have God operate to hold everything out there, otherwise gravity would collapse it all. And that was the only use that Newton had for God, to stop everything collapsing under the force of gravity. It was a bit like Einstein mucking around with his gravitational constant before the Big Bang. That was the only use Newton had for God.
But he also wrote more on the Bible than he did on science. And if you read some of the stuff that he wrote in the Bible, it's brilliant. Like the brilliance of his science goes into the brilliance of his study of the Bible.
Have you read that stuff, Leonard?
Only bits of it. It turned me right off. He wrote more on the book of Daniel than he did on science. And anybody that gets carried away with the book of Daniel or Revelations is suspect.
It's in the Bible. It's in the Bible.
Yes, but anyone who gets carried away with it is suspect.
Leonard, do you think Boyle and Newton, with all their laws and their discoveries of the way, the mechanics of the universe, do they think that God started the universe and put these laws in?
Yes.
Or were they more of the belief that God was also governed by these laws? That he had to follow the rules as well, or that he put it up to have these?
Newton is the one who fudges a bit on this.
Okay.
Boyle is clear that everything was made, in effect, in a theological Big Bang. All fitted out with all the matter, all the movement, all the energy and all the laws as they are. Whereas Newton's view is a bit more wobbly on what the laws of nature are and what God does in there and whether they constrain God. And there's almost a suggestion that he thinks that the laws of nature constrained God at creation, as well as stopping God from doing any miracles ever since.
So that God was also governed by
Yes.
his laws.
Yes.
like Newton's laws.
And the best evidence for this comes from, can't think of the fellow's name, the Archbishop, the Bishop of Salisbury at the time, who had some astute comments to say about the scientists in, I can't think of his name, Burnet, picked the fact that Newton had a nasty allergic reaction to any suggestion that God did anything within creation after he made it. He was controlled out of it all by the laws of science, laws of nature.
Isn't a deist someone who rejects the Bible? Because that's a special revelation.
Oh, they reject all scripture.
Yeah. But Newton did not.
Well, what did he do with it?
Made it fit his laws or forgot about it.
Made it fit in all sorts of funny ways.
Wrote a big massive amount on Daniel.
He had more respect for Daniel than you do.
I have respect for Newton, but certainly a lot of deists took Newton's ideas that they claimed on Newton, and it's not wrong to do that, but they reduced Newton to that little bit of what they wanted to hear and made him a deist in their mind. Newton has been blamed for the reductionist idea all the time. At the turn of the century, Alfred Whitehead was all on
Which century?
opposed to Newton,
Last century.
because Newton sort of said if you know all the atoms in the human body and you know every electron and every other thing and all it's doing, you should be able to predict the future of that thing forever. Whitehead opposed that because he didn't like that idea. He wanted something else. I don't believe in something else either, that was it's too. But it wasn't Newton's central problem. I think Newton had a simple understanding of the scriptures like I do in a lot of ways. I wrote a little bit of what he wrote and it makes good sense to me to look at what he said, but I'd rather look at the Bible myself. Someone who can write more words than are in the Bible, I don't have great respect for. I'd rather read the Bible itself. That's why I won't read the other Bart that you guys around here, some of you like. Bart's book is 8 times bigger than the Bible, so I won't read it.
One other thing that I was noticing out of your talk that I think was a really valuable point was the one around scholars will often talk. I'm teaching Reformation Church history next semester, and one of the things that we'll often talk about is the problem of the squabbles and stuff like that. I hadn't really thought that much about how the process of them. If we think of it, if we think of theological discussion and debate as being the use of energy, to realise how much that use of energy in terms of one of the things that you said was that people weren't really talking about this stuff, and it's worth just recognising that they were talking an awful lot and arguing an awful lot during this period, but they were arguing about things that were not around this naturalistic stuff. They were talking about other significant debates for them at the time. And part of the problem for that is that means that they were always kind of behind the 8 ball in terms of these people have been able to be in a safe area where in the Royal Society and places like that, but they've been able to work this stuff out in isolation together, in essentially teamwork, while the other people were kind of arguing with each other. And that meant that by the time they realised, well, hang on, the real enemy that we've got here is this one, by that point they'd run out of energy to actually approach these things and furthermore actually undercut a lot of the underpinning things that they would need to overcome it.
That's why you get the latitudinarians in the Church of England around 1700. Yeah. They just run out of energy and, we'll just, a whole lot of latitude. I was just about to say, just a whole lot of latitude over everything, so that we don't kill each other over it.
Yeah, latitudinarianism is based on the idea of...
So they just gave up.
Yeah. So
it's a form of tolerance, is it?
Yeah, it's partially built on tolerance, but it's also built on an increasing cynicism that starts to emerge.
And exhaustion.
And exhaustion, yeah. So best understood within someone like Jonathan Swift. So Jonathan Swift popularised it in Gulliver's Travels when he said that the two major nations in Gulliver's Travels, they're fighting, and what they're fighting about is which end of a boiled egg you're meant to cut off, the pointy end or the round end. And that was Swift's response to people seeking, to recognise the value of Protestantism and Christianity generally. Well, Swift counteracted that, even though he was an Anglican, to say, well, the problem with that is that all you end up doing is just arguing about petty stuff.
But it is obvious that you should cut off the narrow.
Well, wait. It's like I don't even know you anymore, Kevin.
We can't ever have breakfast together.
No. So, yeah.
Jonathan Swift added some interesting stuff to the Deist debate. He was one of the theological opponents of it.
Yeah. Another person you attack, who I like, is John Locke. I've partially read his essay on human understanding, or
Concerning human understanding.
Yeah, something concerning human essay, critique, or. But anyway, he never mentions Jesus Christ in the Bible in there. He only mentions God, which kind of supports what you say. But he wrote other stuff as well, and he's actually described as having a very conservative or high view of Scripture.
He just shelled it out of anything of consequence. So it could float high as it liked. That's a very high view of Scripture, once you've emptied it of everything.
What do you mean?
He took out everything that didn't fit his idea of basic common sense. Like Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Locke had an enormous influence on the American Revolution and the American Constitution. And one of the big effects there was on Thomas Jefferson, who was also a friend of Nicolaus, who founded critical liberal theology in Germany. And he was working from Locke. And Jefferson also shredded out... Have you seen Jefferson's New Testament? He took a pair of scissors to it and cut out everything that was miraculous or that he didn't understand. He took that from Locke.
What, you're looking for me to say something?
Yeah.
How do you know? Because I don't know.
What is it that you believe that you also think doesn't make common sense to you? Don't you do
The Book of Daniel?
You believe it, but you don't think it makes sense. Does that make sense?
Allowing things allowing to not understand things? I mean, surely that's Christianity and faith.
it's
That
funny-
you
No,
don't
that's
have
everything.
to understand and explain it. You can just say, I don't get that, but that's part of the greatness.
Science is the
And
same
rather
thing.
than, that's wrong, remove that. I mean, that's what I took from his
You
talk.
can accept something which you don't
Can't understand.
believe, because you could accept someone's authority on something even though they'd written it in Chinese, and you could say that statement, I accept that it's true because of this person's authority, but I don't actually understand this statement.
It's interesting you mentioned that Newton thought that God was needed for gravity and nothing else. So Newton was the one who, more than anyone before him, had understood gravity, and he decided that there needed to be a God for that reason. Surely you could think that in any other field that you study right to as far as anyone can, and decide that God is necessary there.
And it showed that Newton answered that himself. He said, I've got a mathematical statement that tells me what gravity does, but I don't know what gravity is. And we often blame Charles Darwin for his thinking in evolution too. But if you read Charles Darwin, you'll find that he had a very swinging mind. He would change from week to week about what he felt and believed was right. And he had very deep fears that there was a God out there and he was terribly important, and that his argument might turn out to be wrong altogether. And it was only the atheist people outside him who grabbed it with two hands and took it to places that Darwin never intended it to go. I know Darwin really thought his ideas were interesting, and he thought they were actually original, and they weren't either. But in a lot of places, and all through Darwin's life, he was a guy who was gentle with his ideas and not dogmatic about any of them. And a lot of people have made him into a dogmatic person that he wasn't.
He got his ideas from his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, who was noted as a great poet of nature in his day. And Erasmus Darwin's poetry of the wonders of nature was based on Lucretius's poem. And he had a huge influence on the atheist element. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather, had a huge influence through that on the atheist element of the Romantic movement.
Oh, he's found his Wikipedia page.
It must be true.
It must be.
With regard to the Bible, Locke was very conservative. He retained the doctrine of the verbal inspiration of the scriptures. The miracles were proofs of the divine nature of the biblical message. Locke was convinced that the entire content of the Bible was in agreement with human reason.
Once you stripped out everything that wasn't in agreement with Locke's
If
reason,
you look at 21 and 55, you
Yeah,
see
that's just
Kevin put that in.
I think what Leonard would say is, you're just picking out the bits that agree with you.
Part of that also has to come in. You have to understand when Locke's writing that and the context of England at the time. So, the risk of getting too bogged down with the details. So, about 10 years before that, 12 or 15 years before that, Locke's boss had been a guy called the Earl of Shaftesbury. And the Earl of Shaftesbury had fought for the eradication of a Catholic heir to the throne, James VII. And in the process of doing that, he built up a very strong relationship, which he'd already kind of had, Shaftesbury, with people who were religious minorities, non-conformists, even though he was Anglican. And so, and by 1695, you've had what's called the Glorious Revolution, which has seen a Dutch king from a fairly relativistic Dutch framework come over to England and take on Shaftesbury's relativistic approach to religion, which actually was not a bad thing. It's just in terms of religious tolerance and stuff like that. And so the reasonableness of Christianity is actually part of a larger corpus that Locke is doing with the William III and those kind of people, King William III, to justify religious toleration and those kind of things. And one of the central arguments that he was trying to use was that, look, when you got the Bible, we can all agree on this stuff and everything. And then there's these things that are a bit messy, and that gets increasingly big for Locke, which is part of your point. And so why don't we just spend a little less time worrying about that and more kind of have this increasingly latitudinarian thing. So while Locke was still trying to hold within a, theologically and personally, he was still trying to withhold a sense of, classic Christianity on one level, he's also wrestling with the increasing pragmatics and value of having a more relativistic framework for things like toleration in England. And that comes out of the very fact that within 25, 30 years, England had several uprisings and significant threats to their national security precisely because of religious dogmatism.
Locke himself had to go to Holland to escape from this,
Exactly.
and he came back with a ship with Mary, of William and Mary, fame, because that was when he was safe to come back to England.
Yeah. So Locke is part of a process of having a pragmatic relativism while still trying to have a philosophical orthodoxy. Like in his heart he wants to be orthodox, but at the same time he wants to be pragmatically relativistic. And over time, the pragmatism wins out.
Politically astute.
Yeah, he is a very politically astute
It
person.
does kind of make sense. I mean, even in today with all our different denominations and the different things, the differences of opinion that we may have, like even in this group, right? We still go, well, okay.
And in society, with all the variants of beliefs, most of us don't go to war over it.
Yeah, so there is that. I get where the latitudinarians were coming from, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the key criticism of latitudinarianism is that they misdiagnose what the problem is. So the problem is that most of the groups at this point cease to be creedal and become confessional. So what I mean by that is instead of focusing on the creed, which is a unifying document around central truths, that in that process mean that other things actually get left in a grey area. And so creedal stuff like the Apostles' Creed and so on and so forth, they put the centrepiece in here and leave room for grey areas around the side.
Yeah.
In confessionalism, that gets flipped around. And what happens is they go, we take for granted all of those things that are in the centre, but what we really want to spend our time doing is figuring out all of the grey areas and making them black and white. And so what you see at this point, throughout the 17th century, is a rise in confessionalism, which is about dot points of excruciating detail compared to creedism. Yeah. And so
there were still splits in the times of the creeds.
Yeah, no, but anyway, the point that I'm making though is that latitudinarianism, what its solution to that is to say, well, we'll just go all grey. The confessions.
You did like that.
The irony is to say that that's all grey. We're not going to worry about any of those kind of
So you
things.
got nothing firm to stand on.
Nothing firm to stand on. Whereas what Anglicans were trying to argue at this point that weren't latitudinarian was what was called moderation, which is come back to that creedal centre point and leave the things on the outside as grey, and that's okay, as long as we stick to those centre points. But the fact is that in Anglicanism, increasingly latitudinarianism won, and the only option, not in Sydney. The only combat that was available left for that was to become even more rigid in terms of confessionalism. Right? So it became a grey or black and white throughout. No one really took that moderation kind of creedal focus very seriously.
What do you
We've got time for one quick last comment because we're past 9 o'clock.
I wanted to thank you for your lecture.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating the connection with the early two begin school and the influence it had, on later theologians such as Adolf Harnack and others who would say that the biblical scriptures are just basically myths. I think that's been a huge influence. Like you're saying, I'd be fascinated to hear what you're going to speak about next, just because of that influence and how that's affected Western theology.
Hugely.
Yeah, very much.
That's right.
It broke the connection between Western theology and Christian theism.
That's right.
One thing I'd love for you to kind of, if you can dovetail in as a double bonus in your next talk, when you're looking at the German liberalism, you could just check in a little bit about Finney, about Charles Finney into that, and particularly because Charles Finney, when you read his sermons on revival, he explicitly talks about revival not being a miracle, not being an intervention of God, but purely mechanistic processes.
Church growth movement type stuff.
Yeah, like that if you just put in the right sequence of logical events and stuff like that, a revival is guaranteed to work. There's no intervention by God into that. If you have a look at the sermons on revival, you'll find that. The interesting thing about Finney is that he is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He looks like an evangelical, he talks like an evangelical, but this kind of stuff comes in, and it's actually quite, it's very deist in its kind of underpinnings. So if you could have a look at Finney for me, that'd be great.
Yeah, because Leonard doesn't have enough layers in his lectures as it is.
Yeah.
One third of Jonathan Edwards' output was dealing with Deism.
Yeah, savagely. Yeah.
It was huge in America.
Yeah.
But in that bit, I'm going to be dealing with the British argument about it. You've got to everyone calls it English, but it was started by a Welshman, tripped off by an Irishman, and closed off by a Scotsman.
David Hume.
Yes. So it's British Deist debate.